okay, so in the Jungian system, right, you have sort of, multiple sort of loci of agency, right? So you have your complexes, right, which are various forms. And then there are a few things like the well-known, the ego, the shadow, the self, right, the persona. When you're looking at the relationship between ego and self, particularly, the ego is the center of your conscious experience, and it's the center of your self-identification. And one way to look at sort of the process of individuation is that, everything else that happens is just facilitating a particular change in the relationship between the ego and the self.
Yeah, the dialogue.
Yeah. One of the ways that I think is useful to think about this, or the metaphor that I teach often, is the shift from the geocentric to heliocentric thinking, okay? So imagine for a second that the ego is the Earth, okay? So of course the Earth thinks that it's the center of the universe, right? That's the geocentric model. And it looks into the sky, and we see the bodies in the heavens moving around, right? The sun rises and falls with a certain degree of regularity, the moon goes through its phases, whatever. And we see the planets moving in this, frankly, kind of erratic way. And as we try to model that, right, we build orreries and systems of rotation. And in order to make the mathematics of this model the system, we have to add increasing epicycles, right? And elaborate this. And what's the big Copernican shift? The big Copernican shift, and this was not a new idea to Copernicus, right? It goes back to the Pythagoreans, and the church knew about it.
Yeah, Aristarchus.
Right. The big move is that we treat the sun as the center. And of course, Copernicus himself is very guarded about that in a way that Galileo isn't. So we treat the sun as the center, and why do we do that? Because it makes the math easier. Similarly, right, if you are standing on ego and you look up and you think ego is the center of the system, then the movements of the other bodies in the system are highly erratic and difficult to predict. It makes no sense. Trying to relate everything back to ego means that things are confusing and weird, right? Mm-hmm. If instead you realize that the center of the system, right, is that thing up there, right, the self, and the sun, co-appear in the literature all the time, right? It's of course, God is the sun. What else would it be? So, when you suddenly treat the self as the center of the system and realize that everything, including your ego, is actually existing in a systematic relationship to that, suddenly the motions of your psyche become sort of more explicable, more predictable. When you realize that not everything that's going on in your psyche is serving you, the ego. Take the sun out, there is no system. Everything flies off into space, right? The encounter with the self, this central organizing, meaning-producing, right? The thing that is organizing all the other forces in the psyche, as often as not shows up in terms of mystical and religious experience. That's the phenomenology of it. Mm-hmm. So Jung has that position about the divine, basically speaking, too, right? He says, at the end of the day, epistemologically, what possible evidence could we get in one direction or another that would prove or disprove the existence of God? But it's indisputable that people have these forces and encounters in their mind. And his basic point is, it doesn't matter at some level whether or not there's actually a God, because you do have to have an encounter with the part of yourself that is the meaning forming and the locus of the sacred. It's sort of the inexhaustible wellspring of your being. You have to have some encounter with that. And the thing is that he points out is and this thing has certain ways of communicating, and the ways that it wants to communicate are in symbolism and ritual. So even though it may not be an actual divine principle in some ultimate metaphysical sense, you have to deal with it like it is. So to bring this back around to the geocentric, heliocentric thing, right?
Okay, good.
When you have that sort of mystical divine encounter, such as it is with the self, right? One of the things Jung points out is that experience, the encounter with the self, is always deeply humiliating. He's quite kind of keen on this. It is always humiliating.
Now, does he mean that, because I've made a distinction in this series, there's two ways. There's our modern meaning where humiliation is a pejorative thing, it's a bad thing.
Right.
And then there's humiliation in the original sense, which is the engendering the creation of a
humility.
State of humility.
I think it's both.
It's both. Okay.
I think it's both. So I think when he means it, what he means is that it's a soul-shattering experience. I mean, realizing that you are not the center of your own universe.
Yeah.
That it's not all about you.
Right.
I mean, that is the heart of the encounter between the ego and the self. It's not all about you. You have a role to play. The ego has a role to play. The conscious mind has a role to play, but you are not the only game in town, and you're not calling the shots. When we're talking about individuation, you're talking about having an encounter that puts you into a state of metaphysical and epistemological humility relative to your own psyche and the forces inside of it. And the idea is that you want to develop different relationships with these parts of yourself. You want to get things moving in a system so that you can understand who and what you are without having to center everything on your ego, right? But that means developing both a sense of identity with the system, but not direct identity. If you develop direct identity with the self in the Jungian system, that's bad.
No.
It's inflation. The self isn't any of these individual features. It's the thing that allows these individual features to come into existence and supports them to begin with.
Right. I see that. That's very clearly put.
And God wears many masks.
Yeah.
So to directly encounter it is nearly impossible. You encounter it through its manifestations. It's a shape changer. The closer you get to it, the more obvious that becomes. And that's why Mercurius is intrinsically sort of paradoxical and shape-changing and a trickster and is the son of God and the devil, as they say, and has all these other things, right? It sort of approaches non-duality, teases something that is beyond duality.